I am delighted to be here in Waterstones in Perth with well-loved broadcaster and historian Neil Oliver. So thank you so much for joining us, Neil. This is fantastic. Now, you're book signing your book, Vikings, of course, which has been a three-part series on the BBC Two. That's right. So is it true then that really they're not the bloodthirsty pirates that everyone thinks, and they're just deeply misunderstood, these Vikings?
I think it would be fair to say that they were violent, bloodthirsty, but then they lived in very much a violent and bloodthirsty time.
Yes.
They were giving as good as they got. It was a time when there was nothing like law that we would understand. There was nothing like human rights as we would understand them, and people lived and died by power.
That's right.
You were either using power to get your own way, you were a victim of powerful people. The problem, as it were, for the Vikings is they were the last peoples in Europe to accept Christianity, or in fact any of the big monotheistic religions. And because they were doing what they were doing as pagans, as heathens, it meant that they were unclean and unforgivable in a way that Christians or Muslims would not have been and would not have seen themselves. It was one thing to kill in the name of Jesus Christ or to kill in the name of Allah. But the pagans were operating godlessly as far as the Christians were concerned, and that was compounded by the fact that the Vikings didn't write anything about themselves.
Because other people, they were writing about them then.
They were. In subsequent centuries you have the sagas that the Scandinavian peoples wrote about their own past, but they were writing centuries after what we would call the Viking Age. During the Viking Age itself, which is really from the early 800s, the 900s, the 1000s, the only people writing about them were Christians and sometimes Muslims, for whom they were godless, barbarians. And that meant that all of their PR was bad PR. And so they've come down to us as particularly violent, particularly bloodthirsty, but they weren't.
And so when they accepted Christianity then, that would all change, would it?
It did. It was very much the case that we often think of the pagan peoples of Europe being converted as though they suddenly see the light and fall down on their knees and accept God or Jesus Christ. And that may have happened from time to time for some of the people, but in the main, the Christianising of nations and states was a decision made by powerful men, kings, emperors, and they would take on Christianity not really for reasons of faith, but because it was a pragmatic, astute political move. Because the number one protection or the number one benefit that you got from accepting Christianity, it meant that from that moment it was no longer justifiable for a Christian king to invade your country on the pretext of bringing Christianity to you and your heathen subjects. As soon as you say, well, we're Christian, that's off the agenda. You can't invade a fellow Christian
and
nation.
Great power came with it as well, didn't it?
Power comes with it. You also get a lot of fringe benefits. For example, literacy comes with Christianity. And kings, powerful men generally like to see their words written down, so that rather than their way of thinking, their laws, if you like, just being passed by word of mouth, they like to have books of their laws written down and circulated. It makes them feel important, and you then get a sense of legacy. And our leaders today, politicians, prime ministers, they talk all the time about legacy. They want to be remembered. And a good way to have your deeds and your thoughts and your actions remembered is if somebody writes them down.
That's right.
So that long after you're gone,
it's there
with your achievements.
That's right.
So you get benefit. It basically, once the Vikings accepted Christianity, and to some extent, I mean, it was touch and go in some parts of the Viking world which religion they would take. Vladimir, the Russian Viking, as he's known, who was in Kiev and had a kingdom based around Kiev, he auditioned the big religions that were around him. He sent his emissaries out to look at Judaism, to look at Islam, and to look at Christianity. And he found the Jewish faith and the Muslim faith joyless, as far as he was concerned, particularly because he didn't like the fact that the Muslims didn't drink, and he was horrified by the thought of circumcision. So he turned his back on those religions, and he decided that Christianity was the lesser of
the lesser of the evils.
So he took Christianity. But once they took Christianity, it meant that they could pretty much take their place at the top table of European royalty.
Yeah.
They had stuck out like sore thumbs when they were pagans and when they were very openly, sacrificing animals, sometimes sacrificing people. They had certain practices that were abhorrent for the monotheistic religions. And once they became like everybody else, they were accepted. And it's for that reason that there is a sense in which people feel as if the Vikings disappear sometime in the 11th century.
Yes.
Where are they now?
Uh-huh.
The fact was they just became like everybody else.
Yes. Do you know what really struck me was I was surprised just how far and wide the empire spread, because really from, was it Scandinavia to North America?
Oh well, one of the I suppose surprises in a way is that the Vikings came from 3 countries: Denmark, Norway and Sweden, and in some ways 3 very different countries, some richer than others, some with more fertile land than others, some with closer contacts to Europe. So there were different places, and it helps in a way to think of Viking being a verb rather than a noun. Viking is something that you do rather than something that you are. And so the 3 different peoples of Denmark, Norway and Sweden went a Viking in their own ways and for their own reasons. A Viking is to go overseas to have adventures, to gain power and wealth.
And they certainly were adventurers, weren't they?
And they did it all in different ways. So you have the Norwegians who travel west. In the main, it's Norwegian Vikings who are in Orkney and Shetland, in Scotland, and round into Ireland. They are also the ones who pioneer routes across to Iceland, Greenland, and ultimately North America. The Danish Vikings had closer. They had a land boundary, a land border with Europe. So they were in contact with the Roman Empire in a way that Norway and Sweden weren't. And so the powerful people in Denmark, they saw nations beyond their borders who were that bit further down the road to statehood, and they began to some extent covet the power and the prestige of emperors like Charlemagne and the great kings. And they saw in the rest of Europe the way in which they could be truly powerful. Not just lords, not just chiefs, but kings and emperors. So they went out in the hope of acquiring the means to become emperors themselves. The Danes, in the main, come to northern France, certainly into England. The north and east of England were colonised by Danes, largely. And then the Swedish Vikings are completely different again, because their coastline faces east and not west. So when they went a Viking, they took their ships across the Baltic. They found the estuaries of the great Russian rivers, and they penetrated the European mainland from the north and headed east. And it's they who get as far as Constantinople, modern Istanbul. They're in the Caspian Sea, they're in the Black Sea, they're trading for Arabic dirhams. They're in Baghdad. We know that they're taking and coveting Chinese and Indian
silk. I was fascinated by that.
Whether or not those Vikings themselves were going into India and the Middle East and China themselves, well, maybe the archaeological evidence will prove that one way or the other. But they were certainly in touch with people who could get that for them, because we find Indian and Chinese silk back in graves back in Sweden. So their reach was incredible. And really, the Viking Empire crisscrossed the known world, the old world. So they were at least in the Middle East, probably beyond, further east. They're south as far as the Mediterranean and North Africa. They're sailing their ships down the Atlantic coastline through the Straits of Gibraltar and into the Med, and then they're heading west as far as North America.
It's unbelievable, really. It really is. And you mentioned Shetland, and my family are from Shetland, so there's very much a Viking culture up there, as you know. They have their yearly festival up Helial, I think it's called. We're familiar with the long boats, and they set them on fire. Now, talking about the food of the Vikings. Now, in the series, we see you sampling some of the delicacies. Rotten shark is one of them. What was that like?
It's hard to explain, because as I described it on television and in the book, it's a mind-blowingly powerful flavour and smell. When you bring it up to your face at first, it just smells like something that has gone off, really off. But then when you put it in your mouth, it has the texture of, I would say, like bacon fat, bacon fat. so you can bite down on it, almost like the texture of a fruit pastel. It's soft, so it yields. But when you bite it, there's this rush of ammonia, which if you've ever smelled old-fashioned smelling salts, that kind of eye-popping
opens all your tubes.
So you get that spectacular hit. And when you describe that to people, it sounds as if it must be awful. But it's not, or I didn't find it awful, because there's something about, it's such an unfamiliar taste. But then you're reminded that in a world before refrigeration,
yeah, that's true,
and in a world when, we can have strawberries on Christmas Day if we want, you can have anything you want, wherever you want, whenever you want it. When you go back 1,000 years and people had to live through, in the Scandinavian world and on Iceland, they had to live through an 8-month winter with only what they could preserve from the short growing season and from the time when they had their animals. And they had to make all of that last, and so they had to become used to strong tastes.
They would indeed.
And it has, now the peoples in Iceland, I think it's going out of fashion now, but people of a certain age, they still crave the stuff because they associate it with childhood. They associate it also very much a Christmas, a part of the Christmas celebration that they bring out these delicacies.
Wow.
But there is something where you can't become a Viking, you can't put your mind back into someone from the Bronze Age or someone from the Stone Age. That world is gone. But there is something instructive, I think, to be had from knowing that the flavour is exactly what a Viking would have tasted.
Yes, you can recreate that.
Else, this was a flavour that would have been instantly recognisable.
Yeah, like that, yes. Now, also, the other thing that really fascinated me was about the horned helmets, that is a myth. And yet, that's what we really do associate with Vikings, don't we?
There's several reasons for it, we very much do. And it probably comes to some extent from rock art, cave art, engravings on bedrock. And those from way before the time of the Vikings, there are depictions of people, possibly men, with horned helmets. But then that is possibly closer to a kind of a shamanistic tradition. If you go back into the Stone Age of Britain's past, you find things in places like Starcar in Yorkshire, the stag, the antler headpieces. So there was a tradition of dressing like animals and taking on animal characteristics in various rituals. And that possibly why there's an association of horned helmet with these people. But also, sometimes, especially when their graves were being excavated 100 years ago, maybe more, where they were finding men buried with helmets, and the Vikings certainly wore helmets.
Yes.
They wore metal and leather helmets to protect them. But they would also have been buried with drinking horns, because there was a drinking culture associated with burial, a celebration, a last drink.
Yeah.
And then the thing would go into the grave. So pairs of drinking horns would go into the grave with, and they would go down beside the head because you drink with your mouth. So they're down there, and when they were finding them, they're finding metal helmet with horns, and thinking these must be composite parts of the same thing. And so you get this idea.
It's really fascinating.
But
it is.
when you think about it, if you've got men fighting together, if they've all got horns on their helmets, someone's going to lose an eye. It's just an encumbrance.
That's right. That's true. It's not practical, is it?
With cow horns sticking out your head.
No, that's very true. That's true.
You turn to talk to somebody and
I know.
slash them across the
Well,
face. It's not practical.
there is just so much in your book and in the series, and it really is fascinating. So thank you so much for explaining a few bits and pieces to us. And we certainly would definitely get the book, read the book, and make a lovely gift as well. Thank you very much, Neil.
Thank you very much.